Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Carriero with Allied World Insurance Company, and I am one of the co-chairs for the Constance Baker Motley Speaker Series on racial inequality. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you to our session today, and we are honored that you can join us. This speaker series was established by the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation in honor of Constance Baker Motley, who was a trailblazing civil rights attorney. She was the nation's first Black woman to serve as a federal judge and later became chief judge. Judge Motley was born in New Haven, Connecticut, and maintained strong connections to Connecticut throughout her life. We look forward to continuing to explore topics related to racial inequality through this series. Today's session is entitled, We See Color, Affirmative Action's Impact on Education and Its Future. During this event, our speakers will provide a detailed analysis of the Students for Fair Admissions cases, discuss the history of affirmative action and its impact on admissions, and explore the change that the SFFA cases will have on college and law school admissions. Through this discussion, we will investigate how and if colleges and law schools can continue to elevate diversity, equity, and inclusion in admissions. Because as we all know, access to higher education has become critical to the advancement in our society and directly affects who is in the workforce pool. Let me turn the session over to our moderator, Bryn Cullen, the Director of Talent at Elevate Charter Schools and a graduate of UConn Law from 2013. Bryn?
Thanks, Michelle. I'm thrilled to be here sharing this space with so many people ready to learn about the impact of and next steps following the recent affirmative action decisions. 10 years ago, I jumped from law school into the classroom, and now I work to hire and retain teachers in New Haven. Though I'm not a lawyer, my experience in recruitment and education has made me acutely aware of the importance of diversity and representation and the barriers that exist in our system. My job is to put the most effective teachers in front of our students. And if I listen to the research about student success, that means hiring more teachers who share similar identities to our students. Black students who have even one Black teacher by third grade are 13% more likely to enroll in college. Black students have increased math scores when they have a Black principal, regardless of the skill or identity of their teacher. In New Haven, 88% of our students are Black or brown, and 88% of Connecticut's teachers are white. Not only is that lack of representation a cause of the opportunity gap, it's also an effect. We can't find enough teachers who share the identities of our students because of the barriers facing students of color, starting with not having teachers who share their lived experience. The reality is that systemic inequity starts in our education system well before anyone applies to colleges. Like most of you, I'm anxiously awaiting what these recent Supreme Court decisions will do to the diversity of higher education programs, and wondering how many professions will be impacted if the number of diverse college and law school graduates shrinks instead of grows. So here we are, ready to discuss this tough topic, and who better to learn from than the experts who have graciously joined this panel with us tonight. Alex Simonetti, former attorney with the CHRO, who has extensive experience working with affirmative action in practice and has witnessed its evolution over time. Jay Austin, the Executive Director of the Law School Admission Council's Reaffirming Individuals Supporting Education, or RISE, Alliance, which provides leadership and professional development support to student-facing law school staff. Jay's work specifically focuses on how the lived narratives and layers of personal identities of law school staff can be influential in building and retaining a legal education pipeline that adds to the diversity of the legal profession. Spencer Hill, attorney with the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities in Hartford. Spencer is the attorney assigned to the Commission's Affirmative Action Unit, which oversees affirmative action in state hiring. He's also a member of the CHRO's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and has worked on initiatives to implement equity-driven policies within the agency. And Gayla Jacobson, admissions director with the City University of New York School of Law. Gayla's work at the country's most diverse law school focuses on how we can support and facilitate access to a legal career for those historically excluded and from the profession, and promoting public interest law nationwide. Excuse me. Welcome, panelists. Thank you for joining us. All right, so I'd love to start by asking the panel to give us a little history lesson to set the groundwork for the most recent decisions that we'll be discussing tonight. Attorney Simonetti, as someone who's worked extensively with affirmative action through the years, can you walk us through like a Reader's Digest version of how affirmative action developed up until this most recent decision?
Sure. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is really critical in all of our law and all of the cases governing affirmative action. But prior to the Civil Rights Act, there was historic segregation and discrimination, which led to the Civil Rights Act. And with the Civil Rights Act of 64, numbers of protections were established, and also it indicated that no federal funds could be used to support any discriminatory action. So no grants, contracts, or any other program assistance could be used in a discriminatory fashion. The next year, President Johnson enacted or issued Executive Order 11246. And that, excuse me, was really the seed that from which all of the affirmative action concepts developed out of. What it essentially did was it provided a requirement that all of the contractors and goods and services providers and educational institutions who are getting monetary funds or other kinds of assistance, whether property or other kinds of monetary assistance, would have to take action to develop employment policies, equal employment opportunity policies, and begin to embrace models of equal opportunity. With construction and goods and services contractors, they would have to develop policies if they had contracts or grants or assistance in excess of a certain amount of money. It was fairly limited. Goods and services were $50,000 a year, and construction was $10,000 a year in terms of contracts that they have with the government. Along with the Civil Rights Act, other acts were also passed. So, for example, the Higher Education of 1965. The Higher Education Act of 1965 was passed, which was a funding act which fit right into the Title VI model. No money could be transferred unless it carried with it these obligations of providing affirmative action, or the frameworks that were set up through 11246. In the contracts for construction and goods and services, there was a component where contract language had to be placed in each of the contracts or grants that were issued. And in that, there would be equal opportunity statements and policies that the contractors or recipients would have to include in their if you will, a contract for the funds agreement or the work agreements. And along with that was an agreement to develop workforce data so that they could self-analyze what their organizations look like, self-analyze how they were doing it in any given capacity. So in the context of a goods and services employer, they would be providing data or developing and maintaining data that would identify all of the positions in the workforce. And in a construction contract, ordinarily, they would be developing workforces for projects. So they would develop an identification of all of the jobs that would be working on a particular funded project. And then they would later develop statistical information in terms of what the availability for each of the job persons are, the jobs that people held are. So in the goods and services, they would develop an analysis after an organization chart and the positions and incumbents in them. Then they would develop an analysis, which was like a utilization analysis, putting the positions into job groups, and then developing specific data to establish what the availability is. So you would have the incumbent representation, and you would have specific availability of who was qualified in the relevant labor market to be able to be considered for the position. If there was a wide variation, a disparity, then the employer would, or the contractor would have to consider developing goals to try to address the disparity that existed. And of course, factors would be taken into consideration. Is this a single, is this a position that had turnover? Were there other positions in the workforce? What other things could an employer do? So one of the things that had been done when there were numerous, was a job with numerous incumbents, for example, every time new jobs would open up, the employer might reach out to additional locations to try to inform people that the jobs were available, they could come and apply. So that would expand the, recruitment area, so to speak. And they would also, again, revisit, the job description or the advertisements that went out to make sure they accurately reflected the requirements in the job. It could be that the requirements were really being modeled for one person or a particular group, and you want to expand those, explanations so that people who are qualified would know what the job was, know that they could apply for it. They might not get it, but at least they are trying to get it, and the employer is getting more people to come and apply for it. So those were kinds of actions that people could take as corrective actions to try to improve the representation in the workforce and bring it closer to a parity with what was, what positions are filled in the workforce and what the availability is and the other, in the surrounding area or the relevant labor market area. So that would be an example of goals and what kinds of things can be taken. Actions can be taken to satisfy or achieve the goals. And also there would be requirements that efforts that are taken be documented so that you could include that in the affirmative action plan. If you're developing a communication with a local college that has training programs, you could indicate that in your affirmative action plan. Or if you had communities that had qualified workers that didn't know you were even there, then you could go to job fairs and other kinds of, events to let them know. And so in the construction context, it's much more difficult because there are, the construction work usually takes very highly qualified craft workers and journey, other journey level workers. And, it requires them to have certification like apprenticeship certification, journey level certification after serving an apprenticeship. So it's harder to reach goals in that context, but it still is a requirement that if there is a representation, which is information is usually provided by the federal government in terms of availability of craft workers in each of the crafts. and you would look, they usually have it by minority status and gender, then you can determine whether or not you have disparities in the representations in the construction job where you have your workers going. And you can inquire as to available apprenticeship programs. And if you don't have a union workforce, there may be other training schools, vocational schools to send out work. So those were more traditional contracts. In terms of educational institutions, and this was referred to by Justice Marshall and Bakke. He looked at the Health and Human Services regulations in 45 CFR 80-1. And he pointed out, because there was so much of concern about having any kind of race-based classifications associated with affirmative action, he pointed out that if there's a problem of discrimination that was identified with the institution, that the institution would certainly be able to implement affirmative actions to try to overcome the effects of the prior discrimination. And that was actually supported in 45 CFR 83-83B, subsection 6. And they said in that section that even in the absence of such prior discrimination, the recipient in administering a program could take affirmative action to overcome the effects of conditions which resulted in limiting participation by persons of a particular race, color, or national origin. That's important because we're still back in 1965 time and moving into the 70s, and people are still trying to figure out what they can do to implement the requirements that could bring them not only into compliance, but to assure that no unlawful discrimination is occurring. So in that time frame, then the University of California at Davis, let me just raise one more point, that in terms of the regulations, there was just one other regulation, and it was in 46, excuse me, 46. It was in 45 CFR 80.5, which actually gave some illustrative applications to point out that that either a recipient or applicant who has, had an event of discrimination can also take affirmative actions to resolve the circumstances that occurred as a result of the discrimination. And even if the applicant never used discriminatory policies, the services and benefits of the program or activity it administers may not, in fact, be equally available to some racial or nationality groups. And in such circumstances, an applicant or recipient may properly give special consideration to race, color, or national origin to make the benefits of its program more widely available to such groups, not then being adequately served. So it points out that there are regulatory supports to the efforts that should be made. And again, this is going back to the time when the University of California had developed its model or its new system of special admissions program. And in that case, the medical school at the University of California at Davis had opened in 1968 and with a class of 50 students. And in that year, it had 3 students that were minority, 3 Asians, no Black, no Native Americans, no Latino students. a couple of years, or over the next couple of years, the university developed a special admissions program. And in that admissions program, they had two programs. One was a special admissions program, and one was a regular admissions program for the medical school. And in the regular admissions program, the applicants could file their applications for admission to the following year class as early as July of the preceding entry year. And the admissions committee would review all of the applications that were submitted. And then about one of six of the applications were selected for further consideration and interviews. The applications were rated, or the applicants were rated on their medical admission test scores, the MCATs, on their letters of recommendation, their overall GPAs, their GPAs in science courses, the interviews, summaries that were held, and also on extracurricular activities and other biographical information. So they considered then each of the committee members. There were 5 committee members in the admissions committee, still a very small school. So the admissions committee each had a score that they had to develop, scoring the applicant 1 to 100. And that was the regular admissions process. Then they had the special admissions process, and it was that was a separate committee that worked on the special admissions process. And in that, they had in 1973, applicants could ask to be considered as economically or educationally disadvantaged, so that they would then be considered by the special admissions committee or in the special admissions process. And in 74, the applicants could ask to be considered as a minority group member. And in that, it would be African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and Asians that would be considered. So the special committee would review the applications that it was sent, and they would first review them for the eligibility, to see if they should be reviewed by or should be participating in the special admissions program. And then if they were to, then they would look at the criteria in the application, and the criteria in the application was comparable to the regular admission criteria. But in the regular admissions criteria, there was a 2.5 GPA requirement. Applicants wouldn't be considered if their GPA was below 2.5. In this special committee, there was no minimum GPA. So they would review the applicants, and about 1 of 5 applicants were selected for interviews. And following each interview, the applicants were given a benchmark score, which is adding up all of the members. In 1973, there were 5 committee members, so the maximum someone could get was 500. In 1974, there were 6 committee members, so the maximum they could get was 600. So the special committee would also, one thing I hadn't mentioned is they had rolling admissions. So the special committee would send or refer their top candidates over to the regular admissions committee once they had, and then the regular admissions committee would consider the candidates for admission. And they had a limited review. They could only consider and reject an applicant if they had not taken certain coursework, or if they had if there was some deficiency in their application. So when they didn't ever take the applicants that were referred to them from the Special Admissions Committee and compare their applications to the applications that were submitted and processed by the regular admissions committee. So there was a separate process. And one thing that had been happening is when the Special Admissions Committee was reviewing the applications, when the class enrollment size was 50, then 8 of the positions would be allocated for the admission of special admissions process applicants. And when the class size did go up to 100, and at that time, 16 of the applicants that were considered would be admitted. So there was a specific set number that the applicants numbers that the applicants would be admitted on. So Baki was a white male who applied in 73 and 74. In 73, he applied late. So at the time that he applied, they were not accepting any applicants who had a maximum score. Remember, 500 is maximum score of less than 470, and he scored 468. When he learned about the Special Admissions Committee, then he immediately notified the university that he was being discriminated against on the basis of his race and ethnic status. So he applied again in 74, and then they had the maximum score was 600. And he scored 549 out of 600, and he was again rejected. In both years, he hadn't been placed on a waiting list, so he was rejected. He sued Davis for mandatory injunctive relief and declaratory relief, compelling his admission to Davis, and it was filed in state court. It went to the state of California Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held that the special admissions program violated the 14th Amendment, and it issued an injunction against further consideration of race in admissions decisions. And it also challenged or applied a violation of Title VI. There was a lot of discussion in the court in terms of whether or not, it was then, of course, appealed up to the court. And the court looked at whether or not it violated the 14th Amendment, and the court did consider that the decision, did rule that the special admission program was invalidated at Davis, and it was because there were race classifications that were being used. And although the California Supreme Court had issued an injunction against the future use of race classifications, and it also ordered Baki's admission to Davis, the court, and it also issued the injunction for the use of race in admissions decisions. The court did uphold the invalidation of the SAP, or the special admissions program. It also ordered that Baki's be admission to Davis, but it was a very split decision. There weren't groups that could really agree on anything, or on everything. So there was a decision to invalidate the program. They did agree to order the admission to Baki, but in Justice Powell's decision, and he authored the majority decision, he had discussed the fact that when he did apply strict scrutiny to it because there was a racial classification that was considered, and he had noted the special purposes of the special admission programs purposes, and the goals were of reducing the historic deficit of traditionally disfavored minorities in medical schools and in the medical profession. And he didn't agree with that. That was not substantial as a compelling state interest. The second goal was countering the effects of societal discrimination. He didn't agree with that. That was not substantial for a compelling state interest. Then he considered the third goal of increasing the number of physicians who will practice in communities currently underserved. And that was not something that he could agree to. The fourth goal was obtaining the educational benefits that flow from an ethically diverse student body. He did agree with that, and he decided, or he included that in his decision, although the decision was fractured. People really could not get together on it. Yeah. But he put it in his decision, and that was just the decision. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Alex, I was wondering if you could, I hate to interrupt because all of this is so foundational to what we're going to be talking about with the most recent decision. Can you talk a little bit before we switch over to Spencer, talk a little bit about the Grutter decision and how, I guess where that takes us to right before we got the decision we're going to be talking about next?
Well, the Grutter decision was a case, Grutter was an applicant to the University of Michigan Law School, and she was very qualified for admission. She had high scores that would guarantee her admission into the program, but she wasn't admitted. And essentially what the university, and of course she sued, but what the university had done was it implemented a system of admissions where it was it did use a racial classification, but it didn't use it in a consistent fashion, apply the same racial classification to every person that it considered for admission. What it did was it actually considered every person who was applying, and then based on the strength of their application and what they would add to the diversity of the student body, they made a determination of whether or not the person should be admitted, and or actually whether or not a racial plus factor should be considered, to the candidate. So essentially, if two persons of similar qualifications were considered and one person were given a plus, their plus was to create, the reasoning for the plus was not just because race, it was because this individual would contribute something that was very meaningful to the class. They had a class size of 350 people, and they wanted to make sure that there was a very rich class that would, out of which there would be a lot of robust discussion and consideration of all relevant topics, and the viewpoints of everyone could be considered in terms of everything that you experience at law school. So the decision was really one which was unique. The university argued that they were following the Harvard model or principles of the Harvard model, but Justice O'Connor, who wrote the decision, really found that this followed the Justice Powell consideration of the compelling state interest presented in a diverse student body, and the court did uphold the lower court decision, the appellate court decision.
Yeah. Thank you for walking us through that. And it takes us to what we're going to be discussing today with the most recent decision, as SFFA. And it's interesting because you mentioned O'Connor's majority opinion, and I have some notes here, and reading when she said the court expects that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest approved today. It's interesting in the context of what we're about to talk about, because that decision has now come, and maybe many would say it's still necessary. Spencer, can you walk us through what the decision really said, what it overturned, how narrow was it, how broad was it? Tell us what we're dealing with.
Yeah, thank you. So the case, it was 2 cases decided on June 29th, 2023 of this year. Students for Fair Admissions, Inc. versus Presidents and Fellows of Harvard College, and separately the Students for Fair Admissions, Inc. versus University of North Carolina. They're 2 separate cases, but it was one decision, and I'll be talking about them kind of simultaneously. So as Alex said, for about 50 years, the affirmative action had been upheld repeatedly, time and time again. First with Bakke, then with Grutter v. Bollinger, and then even as late as 2016, there was a pair of cases called the Fisher cases, and in 2016 it was upheld again. Same thing the whole time, saying that there was this compelling interest of how diversity really benefits the student body. And again, even up to 2016, that was still held as kind of a compelling interest. But then almost, not quite 25 years, but almost 25 years after Grutter v. Bollinger, we get this present case. It was a split decision again. It was 6-3. The majority opinion was written by Chief Justice Roberts. There were concurring opinions by Justices Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, and there were 2 dissents written by Justices Sotomayor and our newest justice, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. So starting with kind of the majority opinion, Justice Roberts really takes a colorblind approach to the law. He says that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution requires a kind of race-neutral approach in the law, and while the government can take account of race, it's subject to strict scrutiny, and it needs to follow these kind of 2 prongs. So the first one is, again, there has to be this compelling interest, which again, for 50 years had been that diversity has all these benefits for the students. And it also has to be narrowly tailored. And the Justice Roberts, the majority opinion, kind of says that both of these fail when it comes to affirmative action. So how we kind of got there. Well, so the compelling interest, again, that diversity has all these benefits, he took issue with that as kind of too amorphous. It's too vague. He said that the kind of benefits of diversity aren't really able to be measured. It's hard to say, when a student body is diverse enough, when, these benefits that having a diverse body are really felt. And because you can't measure it, because you can't say, 20% of underrepresented students or 30%, because you can't really put a measure on it, he said that's a problem. It's effectively saying that the government kind of can use a race and take account of race for indefinitely, for any kind of reason they want, because you can't really measure to say, hey, we've achieved diversity. Now, the schools, they pushed back on that, and they said, well, again, nothing has really changed since 2016, since all these other cases. But the majority kind of moves past that. Now, because you can't really measure the benefits of diversity, it kind of fails that compelling interest act, but it also hurts in the narrow tailoring part. So what he said was college admissions are zero sum. When you apply for a school, there are only so many spaces, and if you get in, that means that someone else does not. Now, in previous cases, they'd said, well, the way affirmative action works is you're not really punishing anyone. You're not excluding people because of this. All you're really doing is giving them that, +1 or that +2 to their application score that Alex had talked about. But the problem is, it is, again, for Justice Roberts, that doesn't really work. A benefit to one is inherently a punishment for another in his mind. And so because of that, you're not really being fair, you're taking count of race, and you're punishing people because of it. And there are other ways to kind of achieve those benefits of diversity. Specifically, he also said that just the kind of idea of racial identity being a benefit to the student body, he questioned that. And he did it because he said that someone joining a class and having any particular racial identity, the diversity that brings rests on an assumption of kind of a shared experience of race in America, that all Black students joining a student body are going to have a kind of a unique experience that other students won't have, and that shared experience is kind of what gets you to that diversity. But for him, he said that there's that makes that assumption of a shared experience of race in America, and he kind of used an example of a wealthy Black student in a city is going to have an experience that's probably more like a wealthy white student from a city than it is a poor Black student from a rural area. Because those differences are so extreme, he's saying, well, we're really making an assumption that there is this kind of inherent perspective and inherent kind of contribution to the student body because of race. And that's an assumption that the government shouldn't be making, according to the majority. Now, the other thing is that no one could really say when affirmative action would no longer be necessary, and he said that is a problem as well. So during the arguments, the justices asked, they said, well, it was 25 years from Bakke to Grutter. It's been about almost as long again since Grutter v. Bollinger to now. When will we kind of say, hey, we've got enough diversity, we've achieved it, and we no longer need to account for race? None of the schools could provide an exact date for the end of racism. So the Supreme Court says, well, if you don't have an end date, that means it's indefinite. That means you can kind of continually use race for as long as you want, and that's a problem. The schools pointed out that they're constantly checking up on their demographics. They're constantly reevaluating the program, trying to make sure that it kind of fits everyone. But because they didn't have a specific end date, that's a problem, according to the majority, and they had to strike it down. Now, there are two really important caveats to this decision. One is that race can still be considered if it is based on an individualized experience. So a student writing a personal essay with their college application about their unique experience of race in America, that can still be accounted for, because then you're not relying on that shared assumption of a kind of a shared experience. That is saying this particular student, they have their particular experience. And so since you're not relying on that assumption, schools can still account for that. And I think we're going to have a lot of discussion about how that's kind of playing out in the admissions process as we go forward. The other caveat is that this decision, at least that specific decision, is only limited to the college admissions process. One of the kind of amicus in the case was the military. They said that military needs a diverse corps of officers, and therefore military academies still need this affirmative action program. And in a footnote in this decision, Justice Roberts says that still stands, that is a different compelling interest. It's not relying on kind of the benefits of diversity to the students themselves, but it's really talking about the benefits of having a diverse officer corps for the military's mission, kind of engaging with different communities around the world. And because that's a different interest, it still stands. I would note that just I think last week or the week before, Students for Fair Admissions, Inc., the organization that brought this case, they did file a complaint against West Point, and so we will have that litigated soon, whether that actually stands. But right now, at least by the kind of broad contours of this decision, it is only for college admissions. So it's an important limitation. So that was kind of the majority opinion in a nutshell, but the concurrences and dissents are really important here. So Justice Thomas's concurrence, he has written before on his disagreement with affirmative action policy, and he really, again, kind of sticks to that colorblind approach to the law. And what he says is that, if diversity does bring all these benefits, there are other ways to do it. Instead of accounting for race, which has this whole history of abuse in America, there are other kinds of diversity that could equally bring these benefits. He particularly pointed out that religion and diversity of thought is an important kind of source of diversity, and that schools could focus on that, and there's no constitutional problems. And because there are these kind of other ways that you could approach it, the government's current approach of kind of race and affirmative action, that's not narrowly tailored, and that's why he kind of thinks it should be struck down. He also has 2 points which are kind of idiosyncratic to him. They are that affirmative action programs they can actually hurt the students who benefit from them. Justice Thomas, he attended Yale, and it is commonly thought, certainly by him, that he benefited by affirmative action and getting into Yale. And his thought process is that, it stigmatizes these students, that a student who gets into an elite school, if there is an assumption that they only got in because of their race, and I have all of that in heavy quotes, that they aren't qualified, and everyone is going to kind of stigmatize them and say, oh, well, you don't really belong here. You're only here because of affirmative action and not because you're qualified. He also said that it hurts them because maybe they aren't qualified, and maybe they're in kind of programs that they aren't qualified for, and they're going to suffer by not doing as well. The dissents point out, and there have been many studies showing that that is not true, or at least in any robust kind of statistical analysis, there have been many studies about this kind of mismatch hypothesis, and there's just not many studies supporting Justice Thomas's kind of viewpoint there. So that's kind of Justice Thomas's concurrence. Justice Gorsuch, he has a different issue with these programs, and his are kind of where you draw lines. So in his kind of view, there's not really a great way to kind of draw lines around kind of these racial categories that are used. In particular, he kind of focused on the fact that the racial category of Asian, as used in affirmative action plans, well, that accounts for 1/3 of the world's population. It accounts for many different countries. It accounts for many different experiences. And so that is kind of so overly broad that it's not really a useful category to have. And there's no particular reason why you draw the line there, but not perhaps, East Asian versus the Indian subcontinent. There's not really a great way for the government to draw the line. And so therefore the government shouldn't try. He also kind of pointed out there's a hard kind of line to draw in terms of the history of discrimination. So again, he pointed out that a century ago, Irish and Polish people in America faced discrimination. There was, explicit Irish need not apply kind of signs out there. And he said, well, why are we focusing on discrimination against certain groups but not others? And you could always kind of go further back in time and always find some group that has been discriminated against. And if you can't kind of give a rationale that satisfies him, certainly, where to draw that line, again, the government shouldn't try. So that's kind of Justice Gorsuch's point. Justice Kavanaugh, his was a bit shorter. He really fixated on that 25-year mention that Alex had put up in Grutter, that it had been 25 years since Bakke, and it's about 25 years now. So he said, well, we need to respect our precedent and say that 25 years is enough. And so because of that, he said, that's why we really can't do it. He also pointed out that existing law can be used to prevent discrimination on an individual basis. If any student believes that they've been discriminated against in admissions, they can file an individual lawsuit. And so there's kind of a remedy, according to Justice Kavanaugh, to kind of combat discrimination without needing to resort to kind of affirmative action to address it on a systemic level. Now we have the dissents. So Justice Sotomayor, she starts off with pointing out kind of a major just problem with this decision itself, in that nothing changed. In 2016, the world was not so different that in 2023, the facts have drastically changed, and affirmative action that was upheld can now be struck down. The only thing that really changed was the composition of the court. And she points out that is dangerous, not only for reliance on the law, but for just respect for the court and for respect for the law itself. To have this kind of whiplash change in the law on overturning decades of precedent without there really being any real kind of change in the underlying facts or any kind of logical kind of reason why the prior precedent shouldn't be upheld. And so she kind of starts with just pointing out the danger of the decision itself. The other thing she points out is that the government does account for race a lot. It did so at the time the 14th Amendment was passed. She points to programs passed by the same Congress that ratified the 14th Amendment, they had programs specifically benefiting formerly enslaved people on account of race. And so if the people who passed the 14th Amendment didn't have a problem with race-conscious government policies, there's not a particularly great historical reason why we should stop doing that today. She also said that we do it today in many contexts, but the most problematic of which is that it is in the criminal system. The police are still allowed to use race when looking for a suspect. They can explicitly say, we are looking for a tall black man wearing a white shirt, and that is okay under the law. And she said it's telling that the majority is okay with using race in the context of the criminal justice system, but not in education where we could be benefiting society. And so she really points to that kind of picking and choosing that the majority does with their history and with their account of race. And then she points out that, again, there are studies that these programs work. There are studies that show that race is almost never determinative on any particular application, that all of these students are qualified students, and they're only getting in by affirmative action when it's a matter of, equally qualified candidates. Then that +1 or +2 becomes beneficial. But it's not like people are getting in when they're not qualified. Everyone is getting in is qualified. Finally, she shows that there are ways that these college admissions take account of race, and that's through legacy admissions. And that's something that I mentioned we're going to talk a lot about today, and that Justice Ketanji Brown really picks up on. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, she starts with her a really powerful quote that history speaks, and in some form it can be heard forever. She again kind of walks through the history of race in America and just points out the obvious, that race is and has been a major factor in the race of America, and to the point where we see all of these racial disparities among so many different factors of our life, and you can't account for them except by accounting for race. And she uses a really good example to kind of point this out. She looks at two students. One she names John, and one she names James. And John is a 7th generation graduate from UNC. And she kind of walks through all the benefits that has, that he's kind of benefiting from programs that got his family into school, from wealth generating programs such as the GI Bill that was not available to Black soldiers returning from World War II. And all of these ways that John's family, through not because he's John is intentionally discriminating or anything, but just his family has benefited from certain privileges in America, and that has helped him in his application to the school. And she compares that with James. James, she says, is a 1st generation Black student who does not have any of the privileges that John's family has felt throughout these generations. And because his family doesn't have those, it's harder for him to kind of have the same application and have all of these kind of benefits that the other students had. And she says, listen, race is accounted for in all of these ways, be it talking about athletics, where there are all of these disparities in terms of who is in these athletic programs and the training available to them and all of that. And so race is kind of baked into these things. And she says it is only kind of logical but decent to account for them in affirmative action by saying the thumb is on the scale for so much in America. Adding a +1 or a +2 to an application score is a necessary way to at least try to address those disparities. But that's the dissent, and so that is not the current law. The current law is that as of June of this year, affirmative action is struck down in college admissions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for walking us through that. I think one of the big questions on everyone's mind is, okay, that's struck down. Now what? Like, what does that look like in practice? What's going to change about the application process, questions that admissions teams are allowed to ask, potential outcomes, and what's going to stay the same? Jay, you've had a unique experience having worked in law school admissions both before and after Prop 209 in California. Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience and what that has to do with what we now might anticipate nationwide?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. Before I do that, Brent, I want to amplify something you said in the opening remarks about representation matters in public schools. I say that because my older brother, who looks like me, except he's much taller, spent 40 years teaching in middle school in central New Jersey. And he was one of the very few Black men teaching in middle schools for those 4 decades. And so I acutely understand what it means to have someone in the classroom who looks like you and how that can be so impactful. And I know he does too. So I just wanted to amplify what you noted. Yes, let's start here. The state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. That was California's Prop 209 as it appeared on the ballot on November 5th, 1996. Let me just frame some of the players at that time. Ward Connolly, an African-American businessman, best known as the outspoken critic of affirmative action, and at the time he was a regent of the University of California Board, led the campaign in support of Prop 209. California Governor Pete Wilson, as well as Republican U.S. presidential candidate Bob Dole, spoke in support of Prop 209, and the Democratic presidential candidate Bill Clinton spoke out against Prop 209. Slightly more than 9.5 million votes were cast on Prop 209, and it was approved with 54.55% of the majority versus 45.45% against. As a result, Prop 209 was added to the California Constitution. According to the Pew Research Center, with Prop 209, California became the first state to enact a formal ban on the use of racial preferences in the public sphere. Shortly thereafter, with the continued support of Ward Connolly, other states, specifically the state of Washington, with Initiative 200 in 1998, and later Michigan with Prop 2 in 2006, enacted similar bans. But let's go back to the University of California system after the prop went into effect. I'm fortunate that my mother worked at the New Jersey Historical Society, and one of the things that she always had us do was cut out articles, save things that were of interest to us. So I have, and as I was preparing for this presentation tonight, I went back to my files, which run pretty deep, and I found a Wall Street Journal article that I pulled on September 25th, 1997. Now let me read it to you. It starts, when Berkeley's prestigious Bolt Hall School of Law, the name has been changed since then, but it was Bolt Hall back then, opened its doors for the academic year, much was made of the fact that among the entering students, only 1 Black and 14 Hispanics. They are members of the first class admitted under the University of California's new race-neutral criteria, which went into effect for the UC graduate schools this year and will apply to undergrad admissions next year. On the first day of classes, the lone African-American student, Eric Brooks of Bloomington, Indiana, became an instant celebrity, pursued across campus by the paparazzi of the Affirmative Action Press Corps until he reluctantly issued a brief yet dignified statement. The following year, I'm no longer reading from the article, but that's the article, and I can't believe I saved it 57. And thank you, Mom, for teaching us to save everything. The following year, the effect was immediate at what would be considered the undergraduate programs at Berkeley and UCLA, where Black and Hispanic enrollment also fell steeply. In fact, enrollment for Black and Brown students fell across the entire UC system. In 2020, a longitudinal study conducted by Zachary Bleemer, an economist for the Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education, the report was titled Affirmative Action, Mismatch in the Economic Mobility After California's Proposition 209. He reported that by nearly every measure, the ban harmed Black and Hispanic students. It decreased their numbers in the entire UC system while reducing the odds of finishing college, going to graduate school, and earning a high salary. There was nothing to debate about Prop 209, just as there is very little to debate now on this recent ruling on race-conscious admissions will only exacerbate the existing racial disparities that exist in the halls of our nation's law schools. Recent ABA data reports that the nation's lawyers, 5% are Black and 6% are Hispanic, in contrast to the general US population, 14% Black and 19% Hispanic. Personally, it feels like Prop 209 was a sneeze, and now the entire ecosystem of law school admissions is facing the diagnosis of pneumonia. Just as in 1997, the landscape shifted, and those of us tasked to continue the legacy of access for students of color, we responded with innovative strategies. Yet on June 29th, the ruling by the Supreme Court feels like a tsunami, leaving an aftermath yet unseen. I also understand for higher education, the management of risk is real. Academic institutions are are risk averse. So the question, how to achieve racial diversity in the classrooms and remain compliant with the law, is the question that we will continue to grapple with. But let me highlight what I call the hope. One of the foremost goals of LSAC, the company I work for, is advancing access and excellence in legal education. We are continually working to diversify the profession by supporting talented students from every community, every step along their journey. Here's a hopeful data point. In the aggregate, and on the heels of what had been the most racially diverse entering class in the fall 2021, the fall of 2022 National Law School entering class continued this trajectory, with 39% of the students that entered were students of color. Remember, this is also, we're talking about coming out of COVID, racial reckoning, and all the other things that were disruptive in legal education, or just education in our society generally. So the trajectory of students of color, who also set for the LSAT, was pretty still extraordinary. So what are schools doing? And I know my colleague Gayla will talk more about this as well. Well, law schools are continuing to recruit robustly and widely using various strategies, meeting potential students wherever they might be, and that's sometimes being traveling to their campuses, particularly some of the historically Black colleges, minority serving institutions, Hispanic serving institutions, and even the community colleges working on trying to advance and encourage people. We're using more and more digital marketing and social media. Again, that's a tool that younger students or students of today's demographic are looking at. And even many of our admissions colleagues recently posted a series of TikTok videos just talking about the wonders of admissions in law school. We see more and more law schools operating pipeline programs, but yet to be in compliance with the law, because some law schools have been challenged about their pipeline programs, especially if they are specifically race-based, and trying to be expansive in being compliant with the law, but also remaining committed to the mission. I think the most critical thing is, because we saw this in the Prop 209, in the aftermath of 209, there's a sense that you're no longer welcomed. And students feel, as they read this and think about this, they believe they're no longer welcome on these campuses. So one of the things that we are, and I say we, LSIC, and the other legal education entities, the ABA, AALS, locking arms and really thinking about, we have to remind and be completely aggressive in reminding students that they are welcomed, and the institutional commitment to ensuring the success of students is there. So this notion, we've been talking about the B word, the word belonging. And we know from Eric Brooks, his experience as being the only person at Berkeley, at Bolt Law School back then, there's a sense of isolation. And so many schools are trying to do all that they can to dismantle, eliminate, reduce feelings of isolation for not just students of color, but first-gen students who report have different lived narratives. What else are schools going to continue to do? Well, schools will use their mission statements. And in the introduction, Bryn talked about the CUNY's mission and how vibrant and robust that is. So law schools and the central campus will reinforce that messaging to attract and enroll prospective students, aligning their application and their admissions decisions with students who fulfill and their mission, students' academic experience and their mission aligns with what the school is looking for. Schools, either acting alone or in concert with other entities, will spend more resources on introducing law school and the profession to aspiring students. We see this with the growth of There's so many different programs for middle school, high school, and college students that either go for one day or are multi-year programs. And we know that having sustained programs seem to be the most effective, not just one-offs, but I applaud anyone who can offer any type of program at any place to, high school students or college students to think about law school. But if you have the resources and the ability to have sustained programs year in, year out, and track the student as they go through these programs, that's also critical. And then finally, I mean, so much of the rhetoric right now based on the ruling, and Spencer talked about it too, and it's been all over everywhere, is about the narrative, right? The narrative that students will have to supply for their schools. Well, there's a lot of debate about that because on some level, you're asking students who perhaps already been traumatized about their experiences to be re-traumatized. So that secondary trauma is real, but it does provide an opportunity for students to tell their stories. So whether it's the personal statements, written expressions, they're going to be more important than ever. Schools, I think, will be adjusting their prompts, like here's what we'd like you to talk about. They also may be permitting students to have, kind of free text space to just talk about their experiences, but it's going to make the application process a little bit more laborious because there'll be more to read, right? But that's exactly what we do because, systematically law schools tend not to interview, though I do think some schools will probably be doing more interviews in one-on-one personal context. But nonetheless, expanding the opportunity for applicants to talk about their lived narratives, their previous educational experiences, particularly the landscape of that educational experience. I mean, we all talk about students who have access to AP courses, who have access to really sophisticated high school or college programs versus students who have very limited access and maybe under-resourced in so many ways, school districts that are underfunded. You can't expect students to come from some of those programs to be as prepared in so many different ways. So I think, law schools have always had programs for academic skill support. We'll continue to do those, because using the tools that we can to identify the talented students and then supporting them everywhere along the journey is going to be really true. But so those are some of the techniques that I think we've used in the past, right after Prop 209. And we'll continue to do those and just amplify them. Clearly the charge has gotten tougher, and I think many schools and also the players in schools, right? I have to say the law school leadership and higher education leadership in generally is very different today than it was back in 1996 across the country. Revenue generation is much more critical in so many ways now, and so I think schools will not only look at their bottom lines and what they can fund and continue to fund, but also think realistically about being sued. And there's some schools, and I give those great credit for schools, to say, we're ready, bring it on. We're not gonna stop doing what we've been doing. But I've seen other schools who are not hiding, but not as vocal as they have been in the past. And that's pretty sad because, again, that sends a message to the applicants and to the students that are already in the school. So there's a lot to unpackage, and I think we all will spend the next year really seeing what happens. Having conversations like these is so critical to both be informative and share ideas. So thank you again. I'm stopping there.
Jay, thank you so much for sharing your experience. I have one question before we kick it over to Gayla to tell us a little bit more about, what can we do? What's with it? How can we get creative here and still try to pursue the diversity that we know is essential to everything? And that's you mentioned that incredible news clipping where it talked about the decline of the diversity on that campus that very first year. In your experience, I don't know if you know this, but did that ever right side? Did things get a little bit better? Give us some hope.
Yeah, well, there is some hope and there isn't a lot of hope. No, I don't think well, it's been a while since 1996. The numbers have ebbed and flowed over time. I think after the Grutter case, we started seeing other numbers, and there were other cases in there. Hopwood, of course, Spencer mentioned Fisher. I mean, there's been lots of other cases. They have ebbed and flowed, particularly at the elite schools. One of the things that we have seen is the enormous increase of applicants to the historically Black law schools. There are 6 of them. but we know they can't enroll every Black student who wants to go to law school in this country as well. So there'll be lots of questions that schools will be facing as they go forth and thinking about their new application. So there's hope there, but the work has just gotten harder to do.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Gayla, I would love for you to talk us through what's next as we're grasping for hope here. You work in admissions. Are there other paths that we can clear to get to the same goal? DEI, equity in admissions, a more representative legal field. Talk to us as someone who's working in admissions for a public law school. How do you see your work now?
Certainly. Thank you for this opportunity. I have to say, when I sat down to think about what we were doing, at first I was pretty sad and pretty disheartened. But then I started looking at all the little things that we can do, and it felt like we had some control and some hope. So I'm going to walk you through some of those that we've done at CUNY, some that we are potentially thinking about, and just some ways, as you said, that people can get a little bit creative in this. So I think first we need to essentially clean our own house, right? Asking ourselves, what are our practices that promote racism? And for each one, what does it take to eliminate them or to flip them to be anti-racist in outcome? Things like, do we financially reward systems that we know oppress students, such as some schools? I'm on a bit of a rant right now about the term merit-based scholarships or merit-based aid that focus primarily on test scores and UGPA that we know have racial disparities. Knowing that the reason schools advertise their racial diversity is to tell students, you're welcome here. People might have similar experiences to you here. You have allies and mentors. Are schools taking the steps to break down race and ethnicity into those specific categories that Spencer was talking about? Or are we just kind of lumping together everyone who's, not white as BIPOC? Are we even using that? I am incredibly proud of our school's removal of the criminal history question that re-traumatizes and dissuades students who have criminal justice system involvement, often before the application is even complete. And as Spencer discussed as well, our criminal justice system absolutely sees race. So we're looking to see if this is something that's doable at other schools. And I've been on a bit of a mission to help schools make this change and received a ton of support from Jay and others who are helping to facilitate this movement. And because we know the LGBTQ2IA+ community is also under attack, do we have a commitment to using chosen names whenever possible? Do we make it easy to change their name? And are there a bunch of unnecessary hoops to jump through? Do we have systems that share that information across the university so students don't have to continually tell each office, no, my name is, my pronouns are? And if you really want to know what you're doing wrong, ask the students. They will certainly tell you. So we've been partnering with student organizations, reaching out to BALSA and LALSA and APALSA and Outlaws and all the organizations that are affinity associated, and asking if there are ways that we can support their work. Are there networks that we have access to that they'd like access to? Are there networks that they have access to that we'd like access to, so we can help to really share that message that Jay is talking about, that like, you are welcome here. We want you, whatever the Supreme Court has to say about it, the schools want you. We've also done focus groups with them. And of course, sharing a little food doesn't help, but following up on some of the things that they're talking about as well, and really seeing it as a true partnership and moving the school forward. And once you have those partnerships and those practices, like, how are you going to use them to create that sense of belonging? So sometimes I look at the work there is to do and I think, have we gotten a little lazy? Like, are we focusing more on the D of diversity than the actual part about inclusion and belonging? And I wouldn't say it's lazy. It's certainly not when you look at the work that Jay is doing, that my colleagues around the country are doing, and the work that we've done at CUNY. But I do think that we have a long way to go, and really the potential for a lot of creativity on what it actually looks like to create spaces that promote belonging. So things like, are we putting pictures of BALSA on our brochures because we're trying to show we have Black students, or are we using it to lift up the work that they're doing? Do we have support that is specific at orientation or throughout their legal education for things that BIPOC or first generation or LGBTQ students might need? Do we have skills centers and academic support? Are there wellness spaces? Do we have continuing student scholarships? Are there, grants for doing public interest work during the summer? Are there mentorship opportunities? And then I think with all that we've learned, we need to translate that back to the application and again, ask ourselves, are we taking advantage of opportunities that we have to promote anti-racism? Some partnerships that CUNY's created over the last couple of years include, we're participating in Access Lex's Lex Scholars program, which provides pre-law school support for students who have been historically excluded and requires the school to put their resources towards supporting those students by coupling the program with a scholarship. We received a variance to take the JD Next coursework and exam as an alternative to the LSAT exam. So this will be our first year. And we're not exactly sure what that's going to look like, but we wanted to try and see if there can be alternative means to traditional testing. We're also early adopters of LSAC's Law Ready program, which uses an undergraduate course at partner institutions to assess the readiness of first-year law students. This will be the first year that the Law Ready review will come out with the CAS report, which is what schools get, that contains the LSAT, the transcripts, and the letters of recommendation. But the intention is to pilot this as a pathway to law school without requiring the LSAT exam. We also have a very robust pipeline program that enrolls around 30 students in our class each year. And we've made changes to scholarship awarding because those students are admitted later in the process. And because most of our scholarships are given out earlier in the process, those students were unintentionally being excluded. So we changed some of that process so that we could make sure that some of our students who may be the neediest are still going to be in receipt of the scholarships despite their admit date. We're also looking into 3+3 programs to sort of streamline the pipeline and hopefully save people, undergraduate students, a little bit money in the process. And as Jay mentioned, we're looking at how we can coach applicants to tell their story with a personal statement that doesn't necessarily re-traumatize them. Certainly, if people wish to share their story, they're encouraged to do so, but trying to take the burden off students to relive painful life experiences, if it isn't directly tied to why they want to go to law school. I see this a lot along the lines of removing the criminal history question. It's like, tell us about the worst thing that's happened to you in your life. Won't that be an uplifting way to begin law school? So we're hoping to be able to create sort of language and questions around why students want to attend law school without saying like, you should definitely disclose in a creative way your race by means of how society has oppressed you. And then, as I sort of kind of mentioned, we made scholarships need-based, but we also tried to implement some assessment policies that understand the differences in culture may be present. For instance, we don't rely on the expected family contribution from the FAFSA. We actually have our own questions that includes things like, how much debt do you already have? Knowing that students of color, and particularly Black students, often take out a lot more debt than their white counterparts. And knowing that Pell Grants and such cover a much lesser percentage of tuition than they did upon inception. We also ask if students are supporting anyone that is not listed as a dependent on their taxes, knowing that Black and first generation families in particular are more likely to be contributing financially to parents, siblings, extended family, not just somebody that they can claim on their taxes. So some of the structural changes we've introduced and some partnerships we're really excited about, but I know there are more. I know that the Educational Testing Service is also piloting their own alternatives to standardized testing, which I think is called like Personal Skills and Qualities Assessment. LSAC has the Law Hub to help students prepare for their legal journey, putting together a lot of resources that students might not otherwise have access to and certainly not free. And Access Lex is developing an incredible and affordable bar review program called Helix. So the possibilities are endless. And there are a lot of organizations, as Jay said, coming out of Racial Reckoning, there are a lot of organizations that are really committed to creating pathways and creating support and creating really opportunities to put our resources where our mouth is, which I think is really, as Jay said, something to feel optimistic about. And I'll stop there.
Kayla, thank you so much. Hearing all of what you and everybody at CUNY is doing to, like you said, really focus on all parts of DE and I, and not just relying on the D in diversity, and how that's going to serve your organization and the students who go there, is really, really heartening. Does anybody else, I know, Jay, you had mentioned a few things that you were seeing from your vantage point at LSAC. I'm wondering if anybody else has thoughts on what's next in terms of schools still working to pursue that diversity, equity, and inclusion to create the diverse pipeline of lawyers that are needed in our workforce. Anybody else want to chime in with that?
Yeah, I can jump in quickly just to say that one of the things we mentioned earlier were legacy admissions and how this system inherently kind of benefits students whose families had been privileged enough to attend these institutions. There have been a number of legal challenges around the nation to these programs, and I'm aware that a number of schools have voluntarily kind of gotten rid of them recently. So that's a great kind of great to see that schools are kind of taking that approach. And also that there are legal challenges, kind of taking the what was meant as a weapon against affirmative action and turning it on the systems that prop it up, or that prop up discrimination. So there are challenges, there are ways that this decision is being used to hopefully kind of combat some of this inequality by attacking some of these systems like legacy admissions, where we do see these disparities, and kind of taking the Supreme Court's decision to do that. So some good news there.
Thanks, Spencer. Before we jump into, we do have a couple questions that we can use for our Q&A, which I'm excited. If anybody else has been sitting on questions or wondering, should I ask something or not, we definitely have time. Please do submit your questions. We'd love to get that discussion going in just a few minutes. Something that keeps coming up for me is, Gayla, you shared so much of what CUNY is doing to continue to attract students and have that diversity at your school. And Jay, I think you mentioned there are some who are not as, robustly pursuing that. Is there a fear that with this decision, some schools will maybe purposefully be silent there and really show through their silence that that's not an environment they're looking to curate? They're not looking to bring that diversity, and in doing so kind of create separations. Is that something that people are worried about, or is that not likely based on, I don't know, the tide, the way things are going?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, I'll start, there are 190 AB accredited law schools in this country. And when you think about the community of law schools, there's some differences, right? There are some schools that are historically been recognized as being more conservative than others, and schools that are more pragmatic about the ideology and a lot of other things there. I mean, I think generally legal education is often looked at kind of left of center, but we know that's not true. And so I think for some schools, this gives them an opportunity to rethink things. In the various student organizations. I mean, we've talked about student organizations. I mean, we know that many law schools have federal societies as very active and robust organizations. And some of those have, students of color who are members and leaders of those organizations, right? Those affinity groups. So I think it's really going to come down to the school, but I think, without schools doing anything to counter punch the perceptions of those environments, sure, might they see their level of racial diversity decline or a pivot, because again, not every person of color is in lockstep in their thinking in this country. And I respect those who want to go to a law school that aligns with their feelings. And so I think it opens up a whole lot of different opportunities for not only the schools, but the candidates. And so it's a question that we'll see evolve over this next year or two.
Thanks for weighing in. All right. I did see a couple more questions come in. So we're going to turn it over to the Q&A here. I will read out the question, and then anybody who feels moved to answer, it's not directed at any particular person. We'll just start the conversation. First question, assuming that white Americans will no longer be the majority of the population by approximately 2042, and assuming that trends continue to have males going to college and grad school at a lower rate than females, will there come a time when white men want affirmative action back? And to what extent does eliminating legacy admissions address the diversity of admissions?
I would like to take a stab at the first part here, which is really I don't know what white men are going to want by 2042, but we have to remember that affirmative action isn't about being underrepresented. It's about the idea that one has been historically excluded, one has faced obstacles because of the color of their skin that others have not had to face. And so I like the little aside that you didn't read, but I do think that that's not really something that we need to be concerned about because of the true point. This is again kind of going back to the like diversity versus inclusion and belonging. It's not really about the numbers, it's really about what that translates to in our society. And also, I often like to say, and I think Jay said this as well about the law schools that are HBCU, like we can't populate a diverse lawyering population on our own. Like we can't be 5 schools, we can't be 8 schools, we can't be 10 schools that are committed to this mission and make a significant impact on the profession itself. When, you know, even if I think you said 39% of students matriculating at law schools were students of color, our last class was 65%. That's only a drop in the bucket. Like, if you want to talk about the number of years we think this exists, like, I think we need an institutional research person to come in here and go, like, what does that actually mean for how each class entering the legal profession makes an impact on the numbers that are represented there, but also upon the seats that are held. And are these entry-level positions or are they board positions? If we do grant a seat at the table, are we actually listening to that person and their experiences? Do they have allies to work with? Do they have shared experiences that help them to implement systems that are more fair? I mean, I'm jumping the gun here on the criminal history question, but part of the reason that it made sense to us to want to include people who are system impacted in our classes and in the legal profession is because our system needs transformation. And until we have people who can describe what the actual issues are in ways that those of us who have not had criminal justice interaction, we wouldn't know, we're not going to be able to make changes in a way that is really effective or reflective of what needs to happen. So I can answer the question. Do you want me to read it and go into the next one unless somebody wants to talk further about that? But the question is, by intentionally admitting students who have criminal histories, aren't you potentially misleading them about their likelihood of being admitted to the bar? And this is a really important question, and one that our administration certainly grappled with. This was the main question that our admissions committee had, and a version of this question. And to that, there are a few things that I want to say. One is that we do still have on our application, on our website, on our admitted student webpage, etc., information that advises students to contact the jurisdiction in which they wish to practice to assess the likelihood of being admitted to the bar. So we have been very clear with students that we are not making a determination on what your chances of being admitted to the bar will look like. We intend to support you through that journey along the way, and put you in contact with other organizations and groups that can give that support as well. But the other piece of it, I think, is this idea that maybe we're not even valuing the legal education as we should be. Like, are we just determining that if somebody goes through law school but can't be admitted to the bar, that law school was a waste of time, or that it was a waste of money? I don't know. Like, what is the purpose for that individual student of wanting to go to law school? And are we really in positions to make that decision for them? And to that extent, are we as admissions professionals or admissions committee members really in a position to assess whether or not students are going to be admitted to the bar? Like, we're not sitting on those committees. And so, or some of us are, but that also doesn't give us a picture, an accurate picture of what that student's ability to be admitted to the bar might look like. So to make the decision for the student that the education isn't worth it, or to imply to the student that we actually have the ability to make that determination ourselves without giving them a fair chance to show their case, is not what I would say is an appropriate way to go.
Thanks, Gayla. Spencer, sorry, you had an addition to that first question.
Well, as the white man on the panel, let me just I am absolutely a beneficiary of affirmative action. Let's not kid ourselves. I've talked about this case a few times recently, and I like to start with a history of Harvard. Harvard goes back to 1636. For 200 years, they didn't accept anyone but people who look like me, white men. That's affirmative action. For centuries, they did not accept women. They had a cap on Jewish enrollment. That's affirmative action. All of these systems in society are designed to privilege certain identities, people who look like me, and not and people who don't look like me. That's affirmative action. The fact that these affirmative action policies only became a problem when they started to explicitly account for what has been did not need to be said because that was the status quo for centuries, does not mean that there hasn't been centuries of affirmative action for white men. And I expect that there are just many ways that is continuing into the future. So I hope that we get to a point where we are truly on an equal playing field. But this decision is not saying anything that wasn't unsaid. There is affirmative action, has been and will be. It's just whether or not we are courageous enough to admit it. And to the question about criminal background, I do want to point out Connecticut, we have a criminal erasure law. The Clean Slate bill that was passed just this past session is going to erase criminal histories. There's been a delay in implementation of some of its provisions, but hopefully as a society, we're having these conversations, particularly in the wake of decisions like this, where the kind of outcome is saying, we can't take account of a race explicitly. I hope it's getting a lot of people to kind of see all of the ways that we are taking account of race implicitly, and we can kind of hopefully have this reckoning that we're having as we think through ways to get through it, and really appreciate that the ways that race is kind of baked into everything.
Thanks, Spencer. Anybody else want to add anything about that first question or anything about legacy admissions before we move on?
Oh, no, I was just going to suggest I was going to comment on the next question that's teed up there. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, please. You're on top of the ball.
So looks like the next question is, what is the impact of granting private scholarships? And I thought I'd take the first stab at this, and I'd be happy to listen to Gayla talk too, because what she described is some of the really interesting things that they're doing at CUNY with regard to scholarship. Listen, we know higher education costs, and the costs are enormously high for law school in terms of the debt load, and that could be a whole nother conversation. Like, why does it cost so much to go to law school, and what about the debt? We also know that people of color are often disproportionately impacted by the debt, both coming in and the debt that they incurred. And I start that by saying, because for the way schools, come to the scholarship conversation, there's kind of two buckets of scholarship money that schools will use. Their operating expenses, generating from there, or their endowed funds. So I'm suggesting that the private means endowed funds. And that's really quite interesting, because I think what we're seeing, yes, there may be some donors who have been very intentional in how they want their dollars distributed. to students of particular demographic groups, whatever. Obviously, I think schools are being a little bit more cautious about that. Some may go back to the donor and ask for a little flexibility in terms of rewriting how the terms of the endowed monies can be awarded and allocated. And I think definitely going forward, I think you'll see schools request people to be a little bit more open-ended and giving the schools a little leadway. However, there's this theory, and some of our colleagues who've been really quite active in this space have talked about this concept of pooling money. And pooling scholarship money basically permits schools to then allocate to students who've been admitted monies, and then assign them from the endowed funding stream. So it grants schools a little bit more flexibility, but I do think ultimately schools are just going to be, I know schools have been looking at everything. Well, even before June 29th, schools were looking at everything in terms of being prepared and thoughtful, their website, their application, their scholarship funding, everything that's available. But even being more diligent now and doing a deeper dive into every procedural and policy, because again, it's a question of risk management. And we know, general counsels at law schools or general counsels on campuses really want to guide and support schools, but also want to mitigate any exposure that a school may have.
Anyone else want to weigh in on private scholarships, how that is impacted?
I will just add, there's, I think, a lot of opportunities for private scholarships to do some real good. One of the things that we're looking at CUNY is a scholarship for people who have criminal justice system involvement to support them. There are, I think, 45,000 different pieces of obstacles that are laid on people who have felony convictions post-incarceration. So alleviating some of the financial concerns can be really helpful in that population. But generally speaking, we just received information today for a new scholarship program that wants to look at supporting students who are interested in doing combating anti-Black racism in the South, that requires students to move to a Southern state for 10 years post-graduation to do work, guarantees internships, things like that. There are really creative ways that organizations can come together and provide money for students either in very specific areas or students in more broad areas. And we don't have to have it rely on race. If we want it to be a part of the work that we do to combat racism, have it be about that. If we want it to be to students that are, financially needy, have it be about that. Like, we're not going to try to use other things necessarily as a proxy for race. That's not quite the intent, right? But being able to support societies and to support people who've been caught up in systems, in large part, those systems catch people because of their race or ethnicity. And so we have ways that we can sort of navigate those systems. And by saying it's about the impact that the students will have, then we don't have to have as many concerns about the potential for litigation. And there was something else that I wanted to say, but now I don't remember what it is.
If you remember, just let me know.
I will let you know.
All right. Last question.
I remembered.
Okay, great.
I think that there are ways that people can make a financial impact as well that they're not necessarily cognizant of. And so I'm asking anybody who's in one of these particular areas that might be able to look at, like, potentially changing tax laws. Like, if we know that that Pell Grants aren't covering enough, if we know that the amount that a person can put on their taxes for student loan interest is likely to cover the student loan interest that a white person pays, given the average indebtedness of a white student, but not that of a Black student, given the average indebtedness of a Black student, then we may want to look at how racism is baked into our tax law and be able to make some changes there. So there are really creative ways, I think, that we can look at, like, changing all the many things that that are stacked against members of our society. And I think for me personally, like, being able to go, here's something that I can really do something about. Like, here's an area where I can find something where I can make a change. It makes it feel less daunting and less overwhelming. So there are many ways that through mentorships, through guaranteed internships, summers in between law school, for guaranteed, bar support for people who are navigating those waters. Of course, one of our students said to me, well, it's great if you support the bar preparation period, but only if I make it there. So, we need to be cognizant of the fact that students may need that most support at the beginning as well. But there are a lot of opportunities for ways for people to contribute, both financially and through offering their own spaces to promote anti-racism in law schools.
Thank you, Gayla. I love those ideas, working within our locus of control to make a difference. It's powerful. Last question, if anyone else wants to get theirs in, we definitely have time for probably one more after this. Next question here from Peter Kelly. Supreme Court seemed to allow minority applicants to write of their experience with their race be a limitation on their ability to apply to law school. However, that exception is described. Has anyone on the panel had experience with this? I think it might be getting at the, the admissions essays that we talked about at one point.
Well, I was trying to understand the question because I was a little thrown off there. Maybe if someone else understood. So I was reading this as does it somehow limit the students to talk about race? I mean, Spencer talked about the exemption that was granted to military academies, right, to be able to still use race, but now that may be under attack as well. In terms of, and I think we've touched on what it means to have people to talk about their lived experiences and how in some ways it can be a very empowering and informative way, but you also can be re-traumatizing the students and as well as the admissions. It's interesting. I was on a webinar yesterday and it was a bunch of admissions professionals on it. Gayle, a lot of these colleagues. And one of the things that came up was, unlike trained therapists who have learned how to absorb the trauma that they hear from their clients, we have admissions professional colleagues who are spending hours and hours reading personal statements and in tears, right? Because just the emotional toll of having people expose as Gayla said, could be the worst days of their life because students feel almost compelled, and also just in terms of how our society has changed. I mean, things that students are talking about today in their applications, I didn't read 40 years ago. They weren't talking about the same kind of experiences, school shootings, assault. I mean, just the range of things that now so many students are faced with. So I think it's going to be a very interesting question in terms of how students, and not just what they talk about, but we also know, students' ability to write personal statements and to use language as a tool has also been somewhat a struggle in terms of thinking about the educational access that they've had in writing. And so, with LSAC, in fact, we've had a pilot now this is the second year, 3,000 undergrad students, where we are working closely with them just to help them write, right? To be able to use the tool of writing. Because if you can't write, you can't tell your story, whatever your story is. So that's just my take on the question.
Thanks, Jay. Great. I think the last thing I just wanted to touch on, one of the questions I think that was in the chat was really about, does this decision, is it narrowly tailored that it only applies to college admissions? And I believe that I heard that it does, but does that open the door? Are we worried about what that will mean for employment related affirmative action in the future? If anyone wants to touch on that. I know it's kind of a grim place to end things, but I think if someone's got the question, we should take the time.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. So like right now, it is again specific to college admissions. State employment affirmative action, which the CTRO we monitor, it operates differently, and I think in some very important ways. Now, I can't say what will happen in the future, particularly with the Supreme Court precedent doesn't seem to matter too much. But the compelling interest is specifically very different. In this case, they were really looking at the benefits of diversity to the students themselves. But their kind of note about the military academies having a different purpose, I think, is important. With state employment, we're not just looking at, it's great to have, a workforce, walking down the hall and seeing all these different people, having meetings and kind of having those discussions. That's all absolutely true. But there's a benefit to having a diverse public workforce, particularly when it comes to reaching out into communities. It's just the truth that communities have different needs, and you don't always know what they are unless you're part of them, unless you're talking to them on a daily basis. And so there's a very different benefit to the people of Connecticut or any state when we're talking about the kind of compelling interest that justifies these programs. But when it comes to the mechanics of the program, there's also a few key differences. Some of these arguments I'll save for the inevitable challenge, but there's a key kind of element of how our programs work in terms of that pain element. So again, the Supreme Court, they kind of looked at it as a benefit to one hurts another in the selection process itself. When they're admitting students or choosing to make an admission, they're consciously looking at race in the moment as they're making the decision. In state employment affirmative action, it's after the fact. The only kind of consequence of selecting a goal candidate or a not goal candidate, as we call them, it has to do with kind of just writing a justification. You don't have to hire anyone based on their racial identity. You just have to kind of say, if you're not hiring a goal candidate, why you didn't hire the goal candidate. So there's not the same kind of penalty at work there. And that also takes place kind of after the decision is made. So at least in theory, it's not kind of operating in the moment to say, we need to hire X, Y, or Z. And finally, again, just in terms of how the state mechanics works, where it is not limited to just kind of underrepresented communities in the society kind of writ large. There are white male goal candidates in the state of Connecticut because it's looking at the kind of relevant labor force of the agency and kind of matching that against the relevant labor force of the public. So, so there's just a kind of a difference in kind of how it tracks. Now, with that all being said, big caveats that elsewhere there is sign to be worried. There was a recent decision, a federal decision out of Tennessee, where the disadvantaged business program of the federal government was struck down by virtue of reliance on race. The judge in that case applied SFFA to that program and said that we can't assume that any businesses are disadvantaged simply because of their race, according to this recent Supreme Court decision. So there already has been some judicial opinions kind of applying this logic in other contexts. So, buckle up, I guess. We'll see some challenges.
Thanks, Spencer. Appreciate you weighing in, peering at your crystal ball a little bit for us. Before we go, one more question in the chat from the Honorable Karen DiMiola. What advice can you give to students who may be worried about the backlash stemming from the decision, and with that framework, have no idea how to navigate the application process?
I didn't know if I was waiting for Jay to jump in here or not, but one of the things that I tell students in every panel like this, every admission panel, everything, every time I get the opportunity to be out there, is to say, we want you to ask us questions. Like, there are services and places you can pay, et cetera, to find out about the law school admission, but the best source is the law school itself. And every admissions office has student workers that are there to answer questions, to get the perspective from a student of what it's like to navigate that process. But we try, even our bios on our website at CUNY try to be a little less like, here's all of our work accomplishments, and a little more like, this is who we are as a person. If there's someone you connect with, please feel free to reach out. Like, we want you to know that part of our job from the very beginning, 20 years plus of doing this job. Oh, my lights just turned out. Time to go home. 20 plus years of doing this job. What I've been taught from the beginning by my mentors and by my colleagues is that our job is one of education. And first and foremost, it is our job to help students navigate this process and to teach them how to do so and how to do so successfully. So part of my concern with all of this is not the students that are in front of me, you know, being like, call me, email me, watch us on TikTok, or, you know, any of the things. But the students that are so, you know, concerned about this or see this and go, I knew it, they don't want me here, I'm not even going to try. Because they don't have the opportunity to hear from us. No, we really do need you. We need you to not just help our classrooms thrive, but to help our society thrive. And without you, we can't accomplish that. So if there were a way to get that word out to everyone on a Amber Alert type situation on the phones, I would interrupt everyone's cell phone on their way into New York. You can't turn right on a red light, and we want you in law school. Unfortunately, that's not possible, but if you meet any law students, tell them to call admissions offices, because we're always willing to chat.
Yeah, and if I could just say, that's all, it's so excellent, and it's true. I think, you know, admissions professionals and anyone who's a student-facing professional at a law school really sees their mode as being an educator, to educate students about the possibilities, right? The aspirational possibilities. But I also think that, you know, there will always be a cohort of people who have readily available information. And my fear is it's those who don't. And I think that's more or less what the judge was referring to. And I say that now because this is the cycle. Law schools are out there right now on the recruiting trail, big events coming up in you know, New York City in a few weeks, where all, you know, 160 law schools will be at right there on 6th Avenue at the big Hilton. You know, they've finished up in various places around the country. And inevitably, folks always call me up and say something like, Jay, I can't believe I just met someone who was clueless about law school. And, you know, and it's almost heartbreaking because, like, we've been doing this work for how many decades and trying to really drill down and trickle down into the students, to, you know, middle school, high school students, to think about, you know, the law as an opportunity and as a pathway. So I think the challenge will always be there. And I think it's really takes all the wonderful people who are doing this work to continue to help students navigate in some of the big agencies, organizations like, say, LSAC. All 190 law schools in their own way are committed to making sure and providing access and information to students. But it's, you know, inevitably there will always be a student who will say, I didn't know anything. I just showed up to take the tests. I just filled out one application because I didn't know I should apply to more than one law school. I didn't know what a FAFSA was, and nor did anyone in my family could complete a FAFSA. So there's just, you know, those really give me pause. And if anything keeps me up at night, it's those things like, how do we do? And I think that's why I think the whole notion of social media is going to be, you know, a bigger benefit to legal education. And in some ways, so our final thing is that I thought for a very long time there should be a series of trading cards that talk about the wonderful things that lawyers do, similar to what used to exist for baseball card players and other professionals. There should be this. And so I think, I hope that as we continue, we can amplify and spotlight the wonderful things that lawyers do and how legal education really benefits all of our society.
I support that, Jay. Thank you so much. That is the end of our question and answers here. So in closing, I want to thank everybody who joined us today, whether you're listening, watching. Thank you for being here and learning with us. I also want to thank our speakers for sharing their knowledge and expertise. Truly, it's been an excellent conversation. And the Connecticut Bar Association and Connecticut Bar Foundation for holding this speaker series. We'll have more information available about the coming events in the 2024 Constance Baker Motley Speaker Series on racial inequality soon. Please see the chat for more information about today's event, as well as the session's verification codes and survey. Thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your night.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.